I've been playing video games since I was like 5, and I'm still asking myself a few decades later, what is it that makes a game good? What makes certain games succeed and other games fail, even if they're launching in the same genre, even if one's launching with more budget, even if there's no performance issues, which, yeah, like some games still fail and kind of, fade off into non-existence, even when they perform well. What is it that makes certain games good? My assertion is, here's my hypothesis, is that it has to do with good tempo. When I talk about tempo, I'm talking about basically 3 things. I'm talking about the gameplay loop, I'm talking about the pacing, and finally the momentum, which is kind of built off of those first 2. But these 3 things kind of have to work in concert in order for a game to be good, and I think that's existent across every single game. And I think it overrides story, it overrides graphical fidelity, it overrides performance even. And I am going to use Monster Hunter as the example, as you probably already guessed, because it famously has a really rewarding gameplay loop that you could just dive deep into for on and on and hours. Like, this is... I'm still not done with Rise because I think I've just done so many different side things in the game years later that it just lets me know like how good the gameplay loop in this game, that I'm not worried about getting to the end or doing absolutely everything. I'm just enjoying the journey. Like, that's how good the gameplay loop is. So to kind of break it down using Rise as an example here, or really using any Monster Hunter game, Monster Hunter games drop you right into the core gameplay loop. And what I mean by that is, very early on, you're doing what you're going to be doing for the rest of the game, and it's really satisfying right from the get-go. You're not going to be doing anything different in the end game that you did at the beginning of the game. You're going to go to the bulletin board, you're going to pull a quest up, you're going to go eat, refresh your items, always remember to eat, right? And then you're going to go on the quest, hunt a monster, come back and do it all over again. And that's what you're going to do for hundreds of hours, thousands of hours. I have thousands of hours on Monster Hunter, and that's still satisfying. Why is that? Well, one is good game loops, and what a good game loop is has to consist of being able to reward the player in a meaningful way every single time that affects their next gameplay session and makes that next gameplay session more fun. Monster Hunter has this down to a T. When you hunt a monster, you may already have all the materials that you need to build a new piece of a set of armor, maybe build a new weapon. It doesn't take that many hunts to build a whole set. And when you come in here and you're already seeing from the get-go, all of the potential trees that you could kind of go off into and specialize into, that makes it really exciting for the player. Plus, you have a bunch of different kind of paths that you can take in terms of the weapons and things like that. It allows for the gameplay loop to have enough rewards and meaningful rewards available to the player that they don't have to hold anything back. A lot of games do the opposite. They have a gameplay loop, sure, but the rewards are not meaningful enough to affect the gameplay to the point that you want to continue in that gameplay loop, because it's just not meaningfully affecting your world. Think about how meaningful the rewards of the gameplay loop in Monster Hunter are. You go on a hunt, you can build a piece of armor, and you see that piece of armor on your character. It affects your abilities, it affects how you fight, it changes the next fight. Even though you're fighting the same monster, it's going to change how you interact with that monster. It's going to change how that monster interacts with you, and that all comes together to create this new fresh gameplay session, even though you're effectively technically doing the same thing. So that's a really good gameplay loop, when you have meaningful rewards that affect the next gameplay session. It's that simple. Games that don't do that, there's a lot of games that I could point to and say, man, like, there's a gameplay loop here, but really these rewards, I'm gonna have to grind 200 more times in an unmeaningful gameplay loop, in an unmeaningful gaming session where nothing changed, where there is monotonous, where there is no nuance, in order for finally getting something as a reward to affect my next gameplay session. That just doesn't really make sense to me. That doesn't really jive. I feel like that's backwards. I feel like I should be able to have meaningful rewards every single gameplay session, because otherwise, why am I playing the game? To finally enjoy it 100 hours later? No thanks. And that gets me into pacing. Pacing is the breaks in between that gameplay loop, or at least that's what I'm referring to when I'm thinking about pacing. How you pace those out, how long those breaks are, really matter. In Monster Hunter, you don't have a ton of story. I think the newer games have added a lot more story than the past ones, and I'll get into why that is, because there is a reason for it. But there's not a ton of story. There's just enough to kind of give you an idea and flavor of what's going on in the world. Even if you smash through the text, you'll still get an idea of what's kind of going on in the world. and then it drops you right into a fight, especially early on. That's basically what you're doing. You get into a little story session or section. It's telling you something about the world or the game or your abilities or something that you need to know, and then it's dropping you right into a fight. And that's essentially, the pace of the game all throughout. It keeps a pretty consistent story pace, really. And the story itself, or the way that the story is delivered to the player, can help with that pacing. So, for example, the pacing and the tempo is going to feel slower when it's just walls of text, but the pacing and the tempo is going to feel better when it's a cinematic or something really engaging and really cool to look at, especially if it has to do with your character or the world, if it's meaningfully changing your experience. So there's ways to even use the stories and the cinematics and the visuals in the game to help with that pacing, to make it feel slower or faster. But overall, how long those sections where you have to wait to get into the next gameplay session are can really affect the tempo of the game in a very bad way or a very good way. A very bad example of this for me, because I've tried to get into this game probably over 32 different times. Like, I've genuinely probably tried Final Fantasy 14 genuinely over 30 times. At least, and I haven't been able to get past A Realm Reborn because it just feels so badly paced. And even if I break it up, I don't like breaking it up into too many different sessions. So, if I didn't get into it on try 28, it's not like I'm picking up from try 28. I actually try to just start it over again sometimes. So maybe I know that's kind of a bad way to go about it, but really the reason I do that is because I'm trying to see, am I missing something here? Is there something enjoyable? The answer is no. The answer is that even the community agrees that Realm Reborn in Final Fantasy 14 is a drudge to get to, and it's almost 100-hour drudge to get through, and that's horrible. I mean, that's why I had to get reworked, I believe, the first time. But that's an example where the pacing of the game, the way that the story is delivered, the way that it's paced to get you into the effective gameplay loop, can really counteract a player's ability to enjoy what otherwise is a really great game. Because Final Fantasy I really enjoy the actual gameplay. It just feels like there's too many breaks in between. The pacing feels really off in A Realm Reborn, and I don't feel like investing so much time into it to finally get to when it, quote unquote, gets good. Even if I do know and I agree that it gets good. So the pacing of the game is very important. I can think of Blue Protocol most recently. I made a couple of videos on it. The pacing of that game feels horrible because it just feels like you're sitting there for so many different cutscenes, and you're going in between people, and all you're doing is pressing F to skip for 15 minutes. And out of that first hour that I played Blue Protocol, I had 10 minutes of actual gameplay and 50 minutes of just watching, cutscenes or trying to enjoy cutscenes. The writing not being that great. I respect them so much for adding an F to skip. Every game should add a skip button. But even then, it was 50 minutes of skipping. Imagine if I hadn't skipped, how long would I have had to wait through, writing that I was not engaged in, just personally. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's personally, I just was not engaged with the writing, but I really like their combat system and I wanted to explore that more, but it just took too long. And, that really ruined the pacing of the game. It really threw off the entire tempo. Finally, momentum. So momentum is built off of the first two. And Monster Hunter is a perfect example of a game that really truly gains momentum, and then you're just off and running, and you're going to be doing the same thing over and over again, meaningfully different every single time, but your momentum gets fast towards the end of the game for sure, and even towards the middle. So at the beginning of the game, and I mentioned that I was going to talk about this, where we're going to talk about how the newer games in Monster Hunter have a bit more story than the older games. I think the reason for that, if I had to guess, is because they want to onboard newer players, and newer players that aren't familiar with the franchise, that aren't familiar with everything that's going on, that might feel overwhelmed from fight to fight. They're going to want to have slightly longer breaks in between, and the story can provide a break in between every single fight, where players can think about their next move. Like, are you going to change your build? Are you going to change your weapons? What are you going to build next? How do you improve next time so you don't get one-shotted or something? Just trying to remember how they want to progress through the game, and the game providing, especially early on, those small breaks in between where a player can actually think about their next move. And I think that's important, especially for onboarding a lot of new players. Older players might say, well, I'm just going to skip through this, and that's fine. Skip buttons should always be in every single game, because you are running the risk, especially if your gameplay is good but your story is not. Your story is not necessary for a video game. I'm putting my foot down and saying that story is not necessary for a video game. But even if your story was, or sorry, if your gameplay is good and if your story is bad, you're running the risk of players just not being able to engage with really good combat if you don't have a skip button. And now with Blue Protocol, I see that even with a skip button, if you have too much story to skip, then that's bad too. You need to really think about your chunks of story in a game, and how long that break is between a player being able to get into a fight and a player just not being able to interact, or in a player just interacting with a story and not being able to get past that, even when there is a skip button now. Because I can't believe that's a new thing for me. Like Blue Protocol pioneered and innovated having a skip button and yet still having an hour of cutscenes to get through. That's definitely new for me. But momentum is built off of the ability to pace your game correctly and to have a rewarding game loop. At the beginning, when Monster Hunter is giving you that story, that's giving you that little bit of break and time to think about your next move, there's the pacing is a little bit slower, and it's just getting you into the game, and it's just trying to help you enjoy the flavor. But I feel like, and especially with Rise, I felt like once the story got to a good point, and once you get to a good point in Rise, you're just off and running, and then you're interacting with the real, like, full game loop of the game, where, you know, you're posting things to the board, you're going on quests, you're eating, you're refreshing your items, you're building some new stuff, and then you're just off and going. And towards the end, I mean, I can probably do my rounds, and, you know, I have very little break in between hunts, and I'm just going off into the next one, and that speed builds up over, you know, time as you're playing the game. I think a perfect way to kind of summarize that in a snapshot is something like Mega Bonk, which just launched, right? Mega Bonk, when you first start off, enemies are coming slow, you're kind of getting your bearings, maybe you're trying a new character, maybe you're trying a new set of abilities, but as the game progresses, things get faster and faster and faster, and more enemies, and you have to make decisions quicker, but you get quicker at making decisions. And especially as you get more and more experience in the game, you want to even start faster. You don't need to start that slow. And that tempo and that tempo feels really good. The tempo's faster, but it's because you've acclimated to the momentum, thanks to the pacing, thanks to the rewarding game loop, and it all comes together for that beautiful, sweet, good tempo. So I really just wanted to put this out there because I really think, like, strongly, that more games should consider their core gameplay loop and how rewarding that is to players. It should be rewarding. There's so many games that I've played recently that don't feel like they're meaningfully rewarding for a player when a game session ends, right? When like a gameplay loop session ends. For Monster Hunter, it's a hunt, or let's say Pokemon, it might be like a few sets of battles, or whatever that gameplay session is within a gameplay loop. Sometimes it doesn't feel rewarding enough. And I think that's what people kind of refer to as grind, but I think it's more than that, because some grind feels good. There is grind in Monster Hunter, there is grind in Warframe, for example, but that grind feels really good because it still can feel meaningfully rewarding every single time you do something. But some games just, for some reason, they want to keep that reward from you, kind of, you know, carrot on a stick, but the carrot is too far out. You're never actually going to get it. And then you know, the pacing and how the story is interlaid. You know, I get a lot of flack from people talking, you know, telling me that, oh, you know, you just need to read, like, just read, just enjoy the story. Like, genuinely, I get it. Okay, I love reading. I actually do. I love reading stories. I love reading about history. I love reading science fiction. I love reading books because books have really good writing in them. Games don't always have really good writing in them. It's kind of sad to say, but it, you know, I can tell within a few paragraphs, and I can definitely tell within an hour of cutscenes whether or not I like the writing in the game or like the story. But just because I don't like the writing, or just because I don't like the story, does not mean I don't like the gameplay. And having a way for players to fix that pacing, that skip button, that meaningfully skips things, because like I said, Blue Protocol pioneered having skippable cutscenes that are actually still somehow long. But a skip button, meaningfully being able to get past the story, especially if your gameplay is good, especially if your gameplay feels good, that needs to be in the game to help with the pacing, so that the player doesn't feel like their, you know, eyes are glazing over and they're just done. I really think that's important. It's not about being illiterate and not wanting to like interact with text or not wanting to interact with the story, but genuinely, we need to be honest with ourselves. Story is not necessary for games. Does Mega Bonk have a story? Did it need a story? I don't think so. Like, it's just, there's There's even with Monster Hunter, using that as an example, I don't pay attention to Monster Hunter stories that much. I didn't pay attention in World that much. I got all the context clues I needed from the cutscenes and kind of what was going on. I didn't read anything in Monster Hunter World, and I didn't read any much in Monster Hunter 4 either, or 4 Ultimate, or Monster Hunter. Oh my God, why am I blanking out on the name? The Generation X one, like Generations, Monster Hunter Generations. I didn't read the story, and it's just a really good gameplay loop. I don't need to. Plus, games should focus on delivering story through the gameplay more and more often. Okay, we don't. I know there's some players that like watching movies, and there are some games that are basically movies. But games that are basically movies need to be true to the fact that that's what they are, right? Like The Last of Us. I think The Last of Us is fine with its cutscene and stories, but it's heavily a story game, right? And there are definitely people that enjoy those very narrative driven games, but that's a whole genre and that's a specific group of people, and it's not supposed to be plastered everywhere. Additionally, it affects your overall momentum if your game is an action game, right? If you're building an action RPG like Blue Protocol, chances are people are there for the action. People are there for the interactions. Throwing too much stuff into the game to throw off the pacing is kind of short selling one of the best parts of your game, or one of the parts in your game that are most integral to the gameplay. If there was too many cutscenes in Monster Hunter, if I had to wait an hour between every hunt, with how many hunts there are in this game, it would be quite a rough game to go through. And so I think it's not about hating the story. It's about, one, if you're gonna have story in the game, give an option to skip, and two, just being realistic about how much of a break you want players to have in between gameplay sessions, especially if, you know, the goal is to have them, you know, in the game as long as possible. And so that's kind of rounding out everything I wanted to say. I kind of went on a bit of a tangent, maybe was too mean to Blue Protocol again towards the end, but I feel like at the like that, you know, that idea of gameplay, like tempo or tempo in general, that to me feels like the answer to my question of what makes a game good, because the combination of, you know, the gameplay loop, the pacing, the build of momentum feels so good when a game pulls it off well. And I just wanted to kind of talk about it a little bit and kind of share my perspective, see what you guys thought. Thank you if you watched the whole video. Really, really appreciate it. And, you know, we'll see you in the next one.